In 60 AD, the Roman procurator of Britain decided to send a message to the Iceni tribe. Their Queen Boudica had protested Roman seizure of her late husband's property. The Romans stripped her publicly and had her flogged in front of her people. Then they did something that would spark the largest rebellion in British history. They raped her two teenage daughters in front of her. This wasn't the random violence of undisciplined soldiers. It was calculated humiliation ordered by Roman officials, designed to demonstrate that even royal women of defeated peoples had no protection, no dignity, no recourse. The message was clear: Roman power was absolute, and resistance would be punished through the bodies of women. Boudica's response was to raise an army of 100,000 Britons that destroyed three Roman cities, Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Contemporary sources describe streets running with blood as her forces massacred 70,000 Romans and collaborators. The rebellion nearly drove Rome from Britain entirely. But her story reveals a pattern that repeated across the empire for 500 years. Defeated enemies' wives and daughters were targets for systematic sexual violence as a tool of conquest and control. What happened to Boudica's daughters after their violation was just one example of what Rome did to countless women whose names were never recorded. Before we explore the machinery behind Rome's treatment of conquered women, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Understanding how empires actually operated reveals truths about power that remain relevant today. Roman military conquest followed predictable patterns refined over centuries. After defeating an enemy army, Roman forces would occupy the territory and begin the process of pacification, transforming conquered peoples into compliant subjects of Rome. The treatment of defeated enemies' wives served multiple purposes in this system. First, it was reward for soldiers. After the hardships of campaign, troops expected plunder, and women were considered legitimate spoils of war, alongside gold, slaves, and territory. Second, it was demonstration of power. By violating women of the defeated elite, wives and daughters of tribal chiefs, enemy commanders, and local nobility, Rome showed that traditional protectors were powerless. If a man couldn't protect his own family, how could he protect his people? Third, it was genetic warfare. Children born from Roman soldiers and conquered women would be raised as Romans, diluting local identities and creating populations with blood ties to the conquerors. Over generations, this literally bred resistance out of existence. The system was so normalized that Roman sources barely mention it. Military histories obsessively detail battles, troop movements, and political maneuvering, but the fate of conquered women rates only occasional passing reference. Their suffering was considered too obvious to require explanation. Of course, defeated enemies' wives became slaves or concubines. What else would happen to them? This silence in sources makes reconstruction difficult. We know the system existed because of occasional references when something unusual occurred, like Boudica's rebellion, showing what happened when the system was applied to royal women, or strategic marriages mentioned because they served diplomatic purposes. After major victories, Roman armies would march thousands of captives to slave markets across the empire. The largest was on Delos, capable of processing 10,000 people daily during peak periods. Defeated enemies' wives were sorted, priced, and sold like any other commodity. Age and appearance determined value. Young, attractive women commanded premium prices. A beautiful noblewoman from Gaul might sell for 50,000 sesterces, equivalent to 50 years of a legionary's salary. These high-value captives would be purchased by wealthy Romans for domestic service, often with sexual exploitation expected as part of their duties. Older women, or those considered less attractive, were sold in bulk to agricultural estates, mines, or workshops. Their fates were brutal, worked to death in fields or factories with no legal protection and no hope of freedom. Some women were sold directly to brothels. Roman law allowed brothel owners to purchase slaves specifically for prostitution. These women had no legal recourse, no ability to refuse customers, and typically died young from disease, violence, or exhaustion. The economic scale was staggering. After Caesar's conquest of Gaul, an estimated 1 million Gauls were enslaved, roughly a quarter of the population. Many were women and children whose male relatives had been killed in the fighting. The slave markets were flooded, driving prices down and making human beings cheaper than livestock. Roman sources document the economics of this trade: prices, market locations, legal procedures for sale, but they rarely mention the human cost because enslaved women weren't considered worthy of historical attention. They were just another category of plunder from successful campaigns. Not all defeated enemies' wives were sold into slavery. Some were valuable enough for strategic marriage, a tool Rome used to bind conquered peoples to the empire through family ties. High-ranking Roman officers would marry noble women from conquered tribes, creating blood connections between Roman and local elites. These marriages were framed as honors. The woman would gain Roman citizenship, protection, access to imperial networks. Her children would be raised as Romans with opportunities for advancement. But these unions were hardly voluntary. The woman's male relatives were typically dead, her city or tribe subjugated, her property seized. Marriage to a Roman officer was presented as generous rather than exploitative, but she had no real choice. Refusal would mean slavery or worse. Tacitus describes how Roman commanders would distribute captured noblewomen among themselves and their officers, formalizing rape as marriage to give it legal respectability. The women would be assigned to men who had participated in conquering their homelands, forced to share beds with those who had killed their families. The children from these strategic marriages served Roman interests perfectly. Raised bilingual and bicultural, they could serve as intermediaries between Rome and conquered peoples. But their loyalties were cultivated toward Rome. They received Roman education, worshipped Roman gods, served in Roman armies. Over generations, local aristocracies became Romanized through these forced marriages. The grandchildren of conquered queens would be indistinguishable from Romans, having forgotten their ancestors' languages and customs. Through systematic sexual violence disguised as marriage, Rome absorbed conquered peoples genetically and culturally. Roman triumphs were carefully choreographed propaganda events designed to display military power and humiliate defeated enemies before the entire city. The procession followed strict order that revealed Roman priorities about conquered peoples. First came wagons displaying captured treasure, gold, silver, artwork, religious artifacts looted from conquered territories. This demonstrated the material rewards of conquest and justified the costs of war to Roman taxpayers. Next came exotic animals: elephants from Africa, lions from the East, strange creatures that proved how far Roman power extended. These inspired awe and presented conquered lands as exotic and barbaric. Then came the defeated enemy leader in chains, his royal garments replaced with simple tunic, his power visibly broken. The crowd would jeer and throw refuse as he passed, public humiliation of the man who had dared resist Rome. Finally came defeated enemies' wives and children, also in chains, walking through streets lined with cheering Romans. These women had been queens, noblewomen, members of conquered elites. Now they were displayed as objects for Roman entertainment. Their fall from power made spectacle. After the triumph, the defeated leader would be ritually strangled in the Tullianum prison, quick death that ended his suffering. but his wives faced uncertain fates. Some would be sold into slavery, others might be given to Roman officers as concubines, a few might be kept as trophies by the triumphant general himself. The triumph of Pompey in 61 BC displayed families of defeated Eastern kings. Women who had been queens were paraded through Rome as entertainment, their humiliation calculated to demonstrate that Roman power was absolute. Roman law provided framework that normalized and legalized the treatment of defeated enemies' wives. Understanding these laws reveals how systematic the exploitation was. Not random violence, but organized policy with legal foundation. Under Roman law, captives taken in war became slaves automatically. They lost all previous legal status, property, and family ties. A woman who had been a queen in her homeland became legally equivalent to livestock once captured by Rome, property that could be bought, sold, or disposed of at owner's discretion. Slave owners had near absolute power over their property. Sexual access to female slaves was assumed and legal. Roman law included provisions for what happened if a slave woman became pregnant. The child would be born into slavery, increasing the owner's property. Marriage between slaves wasn't legally recognized. If Roman officers wanted to formalize relationships with conquered women, they had to first grant freedom, then marry under Roman law. This gave Rome control over which unions produced legitimate children and which produced slaves. Some conquered women could earn or purchase freedom, but this was rare. Manumission required owner's consent and often substantial payment. Most enslaved women would die in servitude, their children born into the same status. Roman law also included provisions for brothel ownership and prostitution. Women could be purchased specifically for sexual exploitation, with legal framework governing their treatment. They had no right to refuse customers, no legal recourse against abuse, and no path to freedom without owner's consent. This legal structure wasn't hidden or shameful. It was openly codified in Roman law, taught to students, applied by courts across the empire. The numbers behind Roman conquest reveal the systematic scale of violence against defeated enemies' wives. Ancient sources provide estimates that, while sometimes exaggerated, indicate catastrophic impact on conquered populations. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul enslaved approximately 1 million people, according to ancient sources. Even if this is exaggeration, the actual number was certainly hundreds of thousands. Many were women whose husbands, fathers, and brothers had been killed in the fighting. The Jewish wars saw Jerusalem destroyed in 70 AD, with an estimated 100,000 killed and countless more enslaved. Josephus describes Roman soldiers dividing captive women among themselves, with the most beautiful reserved for officers. Dacia was conquered under Trajan, with 500,000 reportedly enslaved, half the population. The territory was so depopulated that Rome had to import colonists to make it economically viable. The Dacian women who survived faced slavery throughout the empire. Germanic tribes faced repeated Roman campaigns over centuries. Each incursion brought slaves back to Rome, men for mines and galleys, women for domestic service and sexual exploitation. The cumulative impact over generations was devastating to tribal populations. North African campaigns, wars in Spain, conquest of Greece and Asia Minor. Every successful Roman military action produced waves of enslaved women flooding the markets. The system operated for 500 years, processing millions of people through its machinery. The genetic impact alone was substantial. Modern DNA studies show Roman genetic markers spread across conquered territories, evidence of systematic rape producing children who carried Roman genes into local populations. Boudica's rebellion wasn't the only resistance sparked by Roman treatment of conquered women. but it was the most dramatic example of the consequences when Romans applied their system to royal families. The Cassini had been client allies of Rome, their king Prasutagus leaving half his kingdom to his daughters and half to Emperor Nero, hoping to preserve some independence. Instead, Roman officials seized everything, flogged Boudica, and raped her daughters. The resulting rebellion nearly ended Roman control of Britain. Boudica's forces destroyed 3 cities, killed an estimated 70,000 Romans and collaborators, and defeated the Ninth Legion. Only massive reinforcements from Gaul allowed Rome to ultimately crush the uprising. Boudica herself died shortly after her final defeat. Sources disagree whether by poison or illness, but she avoided capture and the humiliation that would have followed. Her daughters' fates were never recorded, suggesting they died in the rebellion's aftermath. Other resistance movements showed similar patterns. The Batavian Revolt in 69 AD was partly triggered by Roman officials' treatment of Germanic women. Spanish tribes rebelled repeatedly against Roman sexual exploitation of their populations, but resistance was usually crushed brutally. Rome had military superiority, professional armies, and willingness to use overwhelming force against rebels. Those who resisted faced not just military defeat, but systematic destruction, men killed, women enslaved, children absorbed into Roman households, entire peoples erased. The lesson Rome wanted conquered peoples to learn was clear. Resistance brought worse suffering than compliance. Better to accept Roman rule, pay tribute, and hope for favorable treatment than to fight and watch your women paraded through Rome in chains. The long-term impact of Rome's treatment of defeated enemies' wives was genetic and cultural absorption of conquered peoples. Through systematic sexual violence, strategic marriages, and enslavement, Rome literally bred resistance out of existence. Children born from Roman soldiers and conquered women were raised speaking Latin, worshiping Roman gods, identifying as Romans rather than members of their mothers' peoples. Within 2 or 3 generations, local languages and customs would be forgotten as Roman culture became dominant. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate policy. Rome understood that military conquest was temporary unless followed by cultural transformation. The bodies of conquered women became the mechanism for that transformation, producing children who were genetically mixed but culturally Roman. Archaeological evidence shows this process clearly. Grave goods in conquered territories show rapid adoption of Roman styles within a generation or two of conquest. Inscriptions shift from local languages to Latin. Religious dedications to local gods decline as Roman worship spreads. DNA analysis of ancient remains confirms significant genetic mixing following Roman conquest. Regions show influx of Mediterranean genetic markers corresponding to Roman occupation, evidence of systematic reproduction between Roman men and local women. But this genetic evidence represents real women whose suffering enabled Rome's cultural dominance. Every mixed ancestry skeleton found in conquered territories potentially represents a woman who was enslaved, raped, or forced into marriage with her conquerors. The archaeological and genetic records document systematic violence on an extraordinary scale. By the height of the empire, Romanization was so complete that conquered peoples often couldn't remember their pre-Roman identities. Rome had successfully absorbed them culturally and genetically. The ruins of Roman cities still stand across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, monuments to engineering genius and administrative sophistication. Tourists visit them, admiring aqueducts and forums, celebrating Rome's cultural achievements. But these ruins were built partly through systematic exploitation of defeated enemies' wives. Boudica's daughters, raped by Roman officials, represent thousands of women whose names and fates were never recorded. Every major conquest produced similar stories: women violated, enslaved, or forced into marriages, with their conquerors as deliberate policy. The system operated for 500 years, with legal frameworks supporting it, economic structures profiting from it, and cultural norms normalizing it. Roman sources barely mention it because the fate of defeated enemies' wives seemed too obvious to require explanation. Of course, conquered women became slaves or concubines. What else would happen? The scale was staggering. Millions of women processed through slave markets, forced into Roman households, bearing children who would be raised as Romans. The genetic impact persists today in DNA of populations descended from territories Rome conquered. Understanding this history requires confronting uncomfortable truths about empire. Rome's greatness was built partly on systematic sexual violence. The Pax Romana, celebrated as period of peace and prosperity, meant peace and prosperity for Roman citizens, not for conquered peoples watching their women dragged away in chains. Modern empires followed similar patterns: Spanish conquest of the Americas, British colonialism, European imperialism, all featured systematic sexual violence against conquered women as tool of control. The specifics changed, but the fundamental dynamic remained: powerful men using women's bodies to dominate defeated peoples. Boudica's rebellion killed 70,000 Romans and nearly drove them from Britain. It was sparked by what Roman officials did to her daughters. The rebellion failed ultimately, crushed by Roman military superiority, but her resistance proved that some would fight even when victory was impossible, rather than accept the machinery of empire. If understanding how Rome actually operated moves you, share this video and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from. These patterns of power transcend time and place. And remember, every triumph celebrated by Rome meant women paraded in chains through its streets, their suffering considered too normal to document, but central to the system that built an empire. The marble ruins look beautiful at sunset, but they were built partly by slaves taken in conquest, worked by women whose families had been destroyed, maintained by systematic exploitation that Roman law made legal. The stones remember what the histories forgot.